sometimes it's hard to tell when I'm coming across the PA or not. Okay, so we are in Matthew. We're just gonna pick up in chapter 22. Tim, I appreciate him filling in this past Wednesday, and just got all the way to the end of chapter 21. I thought, man, there's no way make it that far, but covered the ground for sure. You're an intimidating teacher. Hey, I was. I just, I thought, well, whoever teaches that, I said, would just get as, however far you can get. And I was thinking, especially because, and I'm sure you probably had to discipline yourself because there's a lot that you could talk about in that section, and that's good stuff there. So, but I do appreciate that very much. And so that makes it easy just to pick right up in chapter 22. I know we kind of ended quickly on the last little bit of chapter 21 that I taught before I was gone about the fig tree, but I think we covered that unless anybody has a question or anything about that. The main thing in that passage is to point out that there's not a discrepancy with the other gospel accounts. There is just, it's an order of how things happen. Jesus curses the fig tree. Of course, it has leaves purporting to have fruit on it. He curses the fig tree, and it withers immediately, obviously, but they don't see it until the next day. And so sometimes people say, well, you got a contradiction because in one account it withers immediately, in another account it's the next day. No, it withered immediately. They just didn't see it until the next day. At least the disciples didn't see it. And so they asked Jesus about it at that time when they saw it. So I did cover that kind of quickly, but I think everybody got that. I'm assuming. If there are any questions, just let me know now before we move into chapter 22. And I will also say, before I forget, there are crossword puzzles in the back for Matthew chapter 21 and also chapter 22. I kind of rotate those out as I put new ones in, so there should be probably still maybe a few for chapter 19, a few for chapter 20. I think that's all that's back there right now, and then as I run out of space or whatever back there, I'll rotate out more as we go further along in the book. But they're back there in the foyer. All right, so let's go into chapter 22 now. As I said, this is getting into the section where just a lot of really good material. It's not to say that the rest of Matthew's not good material, but boy, they're just, it's amazing. Matthew is relating a historical account. Not every single thing. Obviously, time and space wouldn't permit, and John tells us that in his gospel account. But it still is very much, you see this climactic approach. There's this crescendo of activity that's going to lead up, of course, to the crucifixion and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. And so it's getting really that conflict starting to ramp up. In the beginning, there's kind of this curiosity, and as it doesn't take long, the Jewish leaders figure out, okay, he's not going to kowtow to what we want. He's not going to play by our rules. And so now they decide, you know what, if he's not, then we just have no use for him. And eventually even to the point of, let's kill this guy. So it's really ratcheting up. But to kind of break down the chapters we've done with every chapter, the first 14 verses, this is the parable of the wedding feast. Then verses 15 through 22, they're going to come to Jesus and ask a question. Is it lawful to give to Caesar or not? Is it lawful to pay taxes, in other words? Verses 23 through 33, the Sadducees are going to come and ask Jesus about, they've got a question, a conundrum for Jesus dealing with the resurrection. Of course, they don't believe in the resurrection. So they kind of spin this story and come up with this special scenario. How's Jesus going to answer that? 34 through 40, verses 34 through 40, they ask a question, which is the great commandment in the law. Again, these are all All this question section here begins after the parable of the wedding feast, beginning with verse 15. These are all questions designed not because they say, boy, we've really been wondering about this and we want to make sure we answer according to the scriptures. No, these are questions they ask to try to entrap Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus turns around and asks them a question to close out the chapter, verses 41 through 46. He asks them, kind of summing up that section, what think ye of Christ? Whose son is he? And as we've said before, that's the question that to this day, all men, all women have to deal with. What think ye of Christ? I had an idea last week, just kind of, I don't know what made me think of it, but at some point I may do some sermons, and I don't know if you have an idea, share it with me. I'm trying to think kind of a title of the series. Y'all know I like to do, I like doing series of sermons instead of doing them every single week, because I feel like y'all get tired of them if I do like every single week. You know, I feel like after just 2 or 3 weeks, the members kind of get to where they're like, I guess we're still on that series. I sometimes feel like that as the preacher after a few weeks. I'm like, is this series not over yet? So, I know if I feel that way, probably some other people do too. So I don't know. I just kind of like the once a month. It's worked well for me over the last several years. But I was thinking about this and thinking, again, I don't have a title for the series yet, but something to do with really, really impactful, eternally important questions that every single human has to deal with and needs to deal with. I don't know if I'd say have to deal with, because some people just kind of push those things aside and never really consider them, but you need to deal with. And especially when it comes to thinking in terms of our youth, questions like, is there a God? Do we have divine inspired revelation from God to guide our lives? Is the Bible really inspired of God? Those are two that just immediately came to mind. But one of them is this question right here that Jesus asked in the latter part of chapter 22. What think ye of Christ? You got to answer that question. You got to deal with that question. And, we can push it aside and not even think about it for the entirety of our lives, but you'll have to deal with it on the day of judgment. And so it would behoove us to consider that now and say, okay, and it's, I think it was C.S. Lewis maybe that years ago made the statement about, sometimes people want to say, oh, Jesus was a good man. I think he was a good teacher, but, I think it's kind of far-fetched to say he was God in the flesh or something like that. Look, he didn't leave that option open for us. I mean, the man was either a lunatic or he was a dirty, rotten liar, or he's Lord. I mean, those are the 3 options you got. It's obviously not crazy. I mean, you can read the logic. In fact, this section of Matthew nowhere more clearly shows his piercing logic. I mean, he will make arguments right here in this chapter, talking to those Sadducees. He'll make arguments just based on the tense of a verb. He's not crazy. He's obviously not just a liar. You see that time and time again. For one thing, people don't die for a lie, right? There's no other logical explanation. But this is one of those questions that everybody's got to deal with. Tim, you were going to say something.
Hebrews chapter 2 would be a great setting for that series, giving the more earnest heed.
Hey, that might be a good idea there. Things to which we ought to give the more earnest heed. Got to help me remember that. I don't have my pen. I can't even write it down. Send me an email or something. I need to hang on to that. Is it? That's verse 1, right?
Yes. Therefore, we are to give the more earnest heed to the things that we've heard, lest things that we should let them slip.
And I could even just call it more earnest heed. All right. Might have to collaborate more often there. Thank you. Thank you for the pen too. But yeah, I think it's just that idea kind of came to me. There are several things that really need to be dealt with by all of us. All right, so getting back into Matthew 22, let's just pick up there at verse 1. So Jesus answered and spake unto them again by parables and said, this is going to be that parable of the wedding feast. So the kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king which made a marriage for his son. Now you probably have a note in your Bible. I do in mine, a little footnote, marriage feast. This was common in their time. I've told you before, the wedding, even the engagement period, what we would call an engagement, betrothal, was kind of more or less legally binding for them. They didn't come together physically, the man and his wife, but they were considered husband and wife. And that's why when Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant, well, they're not married at that point, but the text says what? He was minded to put her away. He was going to do that privily, privately. He didn't want to just make a big scene about it, but he was going to need to put her away. Well, in our culture, right up to, those vows and saying I do, you may just say, well, look, I've had second thoughts, we're done. But in their culture, it was a binding thing to be in that engagement. The son, and I won't give you the whole long story. Some of y'all have been to the Biblical History Center. Some of y'all have given you this story either there or just talking about it. But there'd be this engagement. The young man, he's working with his father. He reaches a certain age. He's this would be even probably beyond his what the Jews would call the bar mitzvah, the kind of coming of age. But he maybe one day says something to his father, something like, hey, Dad, I've been working with you, doing this carpentry or whatever it is that he's he would just be doing whatever his dad did, and Dad, I can do this with my eyes closed. I think I'm ready to kind of venture out on my own and take a wife. And the dad may say something to the effect of, well, I was kind of wondering when you're going to talk about that. I've seen that you're ready. You have somebody in mind. Well, he may mention he's got his eyes on this young Jewish lady, and maybe his dad says something to the effect of, well, she's a good girl. Their family, they always go to synagogue. I see them every Sabbath, and they're a good family. She's a good girl. And, probably more often than not, I would say maybe even the vast majority of the time, he's got his eye on her because, well, they got their eyes on each other. They've kind of been talking or whatever. But at that point, the dad is going to say something like, well, let's go talk to Hannah, or whatever you want to call this Jewish gal's name. We're going to go talk to Hannah's parents, and I'll talk to her father, and we'll see what he has to say. He goes over there to talk to Hannah's father. They hash things out. They talk about dowry and things like that. They come to an agreement. Hannah's father is okay with this. Hannah's father and, I don't know, what's a good Jewish boy's name? Irv. Benjamin. Okay, we'll go with Benjamin. Yeah, that's a good Jewish, one of the 12 tribes. So here's Benjamin, and Hannah's father has agreed to this, and Benjamin's father, they've agreed. So at that point, they'll take a sip out of a cup. And that's kind of, okay, we've agreed upon this. Now they got to call Hannah in there. Because, see, she gets a say in it. We think arranged marriage, we think this, this is how it's going to be. But it's not. She has a say. She can say no. But at the same time, how many times can she say no before they stop asking, right? But again, more often than not, they know each other and they like each other, and this is happening because they've been maybe talking and kind of sweet on each other, as we would say. So they take a sip out of the cup. They call Hannah in. Benjamin has said he's interested. I've been talking to your father, or I've been talking to Benjamin's father here. Hannah's father would say to her, and what do you think? And again, probably more often than not, she knows what's going on, and she's, blushing, and she says, oh, yes, absolutely. And so they call Benjamin in, and man, he's on cloud nine. So now, Benjamin and Hannah take a drink from the same cup. And now they are legally betrothed. Benjamin then has to give Hannah's father some money, because this is part of that dowry agreement. And at that point, you know what Benjamin is? Broke. So they're not getting married. He goes home to work. And so he starts to work. But he also, part of what he's doing at home is he's building on, and this was very common, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even still do this some over there, but they would build on. Sometimes you would have huge extended families living kind of almost in the same residence. And so a Latin word began to be used, insula. They would sometimes build on. You could build sometimes into a hillside or kind of a mountainous area, or sometimes you would build up, and it would just be, here's brother marries, and he builds a room over here to the side. Another brother marries, he builds, another story on top of that. And then over here, extend over this way. And next thing you know, we have this big thing, and this Latin term insula began to be used, and wasn't too long before it got shortened, and an English word was coined, inn. And so it's kind of unfortunate. It's one of those, weak spots of the King James when it says that Mary had baby Jesus, out with the animals because there was no room for them in the inn. And we have the idea like they went to the Hampton and the guy says, sorry, we're all booked up. Well, it wasn't like that. It would have been like an insula. Now, that's a Latin term. The Greek term would be, I just went blank, kataluma, and it's just guest room. But they just build onto these houses. Sometimes they just expand. So not Simon, what did we name him? Benjamin, this Jewish boy. He's going to go home, and so he's got to build on to the house, so where they're going to live, and he's got to get approval from Dad. And if Dad doesn't like it, or if he messes something up, Dad's going to make him start all over. And they say that it typically would take somewhere around a year. And during this time, he might say something to Hannah to the effect of, Hannah, in my Father's house, there are many rooms, and I'm going, and I'm gonna prepare a place for you and me, and when it's ready, I'm coming to get you, and I'm gonna take you home with me, and we're gonna live together, happily ever after, we might say in our vernacular. And it does. Chris mentioned it sounds just very familiar, doesn't it? John 14, and that's what Jesus says to the apostles. And of course, the church is the bride of Christ. And he says, I'm going to prepare a place. That's language very familiar to those Jews. And when you kind of learn about that custom, it sort of comes, as Vern at the Biblical History Center used to say, comes off the page for you. But so this young man, he continues to do this. And finally, again, it's usually about a year. And he's going to get the approval from Dad. And at that time, he's going to go and get his bride. During that time when he's building onto the house and people are waiting and, they come and they want to know, when's the big day? And what that means is, well, it means two things. When's the party, number one, and number two, don't forget to invite me. So that's kind of how they would ask time to time, when's the big day? Hey, Benjamin, when's the day? And that means, hey, we're all waiting for this party. Don't forget to send us an invite. And so finally the day comes, and he would, and this is, it sounds different to us, but when we get to Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is going to talk about there were foolish and there were wise virgins. And the foolish ones, they didn't bring any oil, and so they realized we need more oil. Can you give us some of yours? And the wise ones say, look, if we give you some of ours, we may run out. You need to go to the people that sell. And so at midnight, the call comes out, the groom is coming. And it's like, you ever read that and you thought, at midnight? I mean, I've been to some, weddings that were a little different, maybe different time. Sometimes it's on a weekday instead of on the weekend or whatever. I don't think I've ever been to a midnight wedding. And I used to read that and I would think that seems odd. What's going to happen though is in our, fictitious story here, Benjamin, when everything's ready, Dad signs off. He lets her know, soon, you be ready. I don't know exactly when, but be ready. Now again, that's familiar language, right? I mean, over and over again, Jesus says, watch, be ready. He doesn't tell us when he's coming back, and all the signs that are given are not signs for when Jesus is going to return. Those deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. But he says, you be ready, because any day now. And so when he comes, he's going to come probably in the middle of the night. Why? Well, at the betrothal, they're legally married, but being discreet, they want their privacy, because now they're going to come together physically. And so he comes, and they announce, here's the bridegroom's coming, so he'll take his bride, take her home. The groomsman's going to stand guard, because they want their privacy. And then, at some point, he will come out and he will announce, all right, the marriage has been consummated, and what that means is, party is on. And if he was the son of a wealthy person, this party might last for like a week or two. And that's what is the of Matthew 22. There is a man here, a king, who is, and again, here's one who's wealthy. So this could go on for who knows how long, being a king and the son of a king. So he's going to have a marriage feast for his son. Verse 3 picks up, he sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. Why would people not come to the wedding? I mean, it's going to be great, right? I mean, this is the king. He's going to throw a great party. He's going to have food. He's going to have entertainment. Can't imagine why somebody would turn that down, but again, that's part of the lesson Jesus is teaching here in this parable. Again, he sent forth other servants, saying, tell them what you're bidden. Behold, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come unto the marriage. One of the things I learned doing the tours down there in LaGrange is 40% of the Jews' diet came from the grains they harvested. Barley and wheat, and especially if you were poor, mostly barley. That was kind of the poor man's grain. So one of the things that, I guess I kind of knew this before, but I didn't really give it a whole lot of thought until doing that and doing some tours. One of the things that it was really a special occasion or some kind of a big deal if you had meat. Now, when I was growing up, we'd always laugh because my uncle, he would get, upset if there was a meal served and he's like, there's no meat in this meal. Vegetarian plate? Excuse me? What? I don't think so. Maybe if you're talking green beans with a whole lot of bacon in them or something. But he always expected that every meal. And sometimes we do, right? We think, that's a meal. You got a meat, 2 vegetables, meat, 3 vegetables. A lot of times you go to restaurants. That's how they price things. Here it is. If you want a meat entree and 2 sides, you get the idea. To them, though, it was a big deal to have meat. You didn't just give that to anybody. It had to be a special occasion because it represented wealth. Now, here's a king, obviously, so he's got the wealth. But, he's letting everybody know, I have killed oxen, I have killed fatlings. And when you get over to Luke 15, of course, the prodigal son comes home and the father says, we're going to kill the fatted calf. This is not just meat. We're going to have this calf that we've been fattening up for slaughter. We're going to do this now. And so the big brother, which represented those Jews, he's so upset about that. I can't believe this. Not only are you throwing a party for this heathen who's come home, but you're going to kill the fatted calf? So the king says he's got oxen, he's got fatlings. Again, these are this same idea, fatted calf. Killed, and all things are ready. We've put in the work. We got everything just right. And so the exhortation is, come unto the marriage feast. But they made light of it. They just kind of, we might say they scoff, just sort of, and they went their ways, one to his farm, another to his merchandise, and the remnant took his servants and entreated them spitefully and slew them. So some of them not only just say no, some of them not only just kind of blow it off, just, I've got time for that. But some of them actually took the servants and said, not only are we not coming to the wedding, the feast, but we're going to rough you up. And some of them even to the point of killing them. But you know word's going to get back to the king, right? Verse 7, when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. Then saith he to his servants, the wedding is ready, but they which were bidden were not worthy. Go ye therefore into the highways, and as many as ye shall find, bid to the marriage. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all as many as they found, both bad and good, and the wedding was furnished with guests. And when the king came in to see the guests, he saw there a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he saith unto him, Friend, how camest thou in hither not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless. Then said the king to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Jesus spoke this parable the same day that he taught the previous two parables, one dealing with the two sons, which we looked at last week, one dealing with the wicked husbandman. These were all spoken right there in the temple area. After the parable of the wicked husbandman, the Jewish leaders wanted to seize him. It was kind of where Tim left off last week, is right at the end of that chapter, where they kind of go, yeah, what's he going to do? He's going to miserably destroy those people. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, he's talking about us. And now they're upset, but they feared the people. And that's those last two verses of chapter 21. Just like with the parable of the wicked husbandman, Jesus here teaches there's going to be punishment, there's going to be destruction to those who reject him as the Son of God, those who reject him as the Messiah. By the way, this parable is similar to one recorded in the book of Luke chapter 14, 16 through 24, but they are not the same because there are some significant differences. The parable that Luke records in Luke 14 was told earlier. There was not such violent opposition to Jesus from these Jewish leaders as there is here in the context of Matthew 22. The parable in Luke 14 was spoken to one man in a private setting in his home, not to the multitude in the temple area as with here in Matthew 22. Luke 14, the one who gave the feast is simply called a certain man. Here, of course, it is a king giving the feast. Parables always have... Thank you, Robert. I was saying, I hope somebody gets it. One main meaning. Thank you. Parables always have one main meaning. When you study a parable, it's not to say there are not other lessons there, because there are. I guarantee you there'll be lots of lessons that we can learn from them. But don't lose sight of that one main point. What is it here in Matthew 22, 1 through 14? It is... Looking at the whole context, is to cause the Jews, and especially the Jewish leaders, to see the destruction coming if they reject Jesus as the Christ. It's also to show them that because of their rejection, the kingdom is going to be given to the Gentiles. Not to say the Jews can't be saved, but it's a consequence of their rejection. And again, there's a lot more that we can learn as well, but those are kind of together. And really, I think that first one is, if I had to just center in on one main purpose, is to realize the impending destruction for those who reject Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah. You cannot just spurn the invitation. There's a song we sing that uses that phrase. You can't just spurn the invitation and have God say, oh, well, too bad. I hate it. There are consequences. He gives us the choice to say yes or no, but understanding that there are consequences saying yes or no. There are going to be consequences to that, and so that's the main point of this parable. It's also of interest. It's also of note, or an interesting note, I guess we could say, that Jesus quite frequently uses marriage or marriage feasts in his teaching to make points. It's not He's not teaching about marriage here, but he's using it to illustrate, and that happens quite a bit. Again, Matthew 25. I keep saying Matthew 25. Am I right on that? I'm doubting myself. Yes, okay. I was thinking the judgment scene. That's at the end of the chapter, and I'd been saying the wrong chapter. But yeah, Matthew 25. He's going to do this again. He's going to use marriage, a familiar marriage setting, to teach a lesson. So Jesus does that quite a bit. The king here represents God the Father. I think that's pretty self-evident. The Son is Jesus. In this particular parable, there's really very little about the Son's actions. I don't really know if there's anything about the Son's actions in this parable. He's indirectly involved, but the emphasis in this parable is the Father's reaction to those people who reject the invitation to the marriage feast for his Son. Those who were first bidden would be the Jews. They were bidden first. The gospel went first to the Jews. The servants who bid them would be God's messengers, the prophets, preparing the people, even down to John, and those, apostles and so on that would come later on. Those brought in from the highways and the byways after the original folks rejected. And so he says to verse 9, "Go therefore into the highways, many as ye shall find, bid to the marriage." And so they go out and they get those folks. Those would be the Gentiles who would come in later on. Next, let's notice here, talking about this, kind of unpacking the parable, the invitation was given to those who were already invited. Notice what he says. He sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding. I think I noticed this from my father-in-law's notes. I'm not sure I'd ever picked up on that. I've studied this before. I think I've even maybe preached or at least taught a class on this before. And I don't think I really caught it. He went to call them that were bidden to the wedding. He sent an invitation for those who were invited. And you think, well, that doesn't make sense. But again, this was a custom of their culture. They would quite commonly send an early invitation, and then especially in the case of a king or a very wealthy man, he would later on send servants closer to time when everything is ready. And say, go get everybody who we've sent invitations to and tell them. So they're going to specific people. Again, the Jews in this context and the application. The Jews had been bidden for hundreds of years. They'd been told about this wedding feast, which is an allusion to the kingdom, throughout the Old Testament. They'd had these prophecies of the coming Messiah, his kingdom, Isaiah 2 through 4, Isaiah 7:14 about the virgin birth, Daniel chapter 2, Daniel, several places in the book of Daniel. But on and on, these Old Testament prophecies, we looked at 3 just, when was that? March 20th in a Sunday morning sermon. I remember that because I've just been editing on that one for the radio. We looked at Isaiah 2. No, that wasn't the first one we looked at. I was trying to remember what was the first one we looked at. It just went blank. All I can remember right now is Daniel 2 and Zechariah 6, 12, and 13. But I have no idea why I cannot think of that other one. It's going to come to me in the middle of the night, and I'm just going to, it'll drive me crazy. But anyways, that's the worst, man, when that happens. So the Jews of Jesus' day, they were waiting for this kingdom to come. They knew about it. They're waiting for it. But again, they got these preconceived notions. And so when it comes, and when they're waiting for their Messiah, but when he comes, they miss him. For the most part, not everybody. But it's because of those preconceived notions. But God sent John. He sent Jesus. God sent the apostles. God sent at least 70 other disciples. We notice that again in that same sermon. They went out saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." They had plenty of warning. They were invited hundreds of years in advance. Now, the other servants, verse 4, he sent forth other servants, saying, "Tell them which are bidden, behold, I have prepared my dinner." Sometimes people say, well, who are those other servants? Were it some of those that were noted previously? Or would it be those after Pentecost, like Stephen, Philip, the apostles? I don't know. I don't know that anybody can answer that definitively, but the important idea is the reaction was the same. They rejected the invitation. Just like with the first invite, or when the first servants came out, rejected it, so they did when the other servants came. And that's what the emphasis there. The king sending the servants a second time shows God's long suffering. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So he sends out the invitations. Again, they've been invited hundreds of years in advance. He says to his servants, everything, go get everybody that's been invited and tell them all things are ready. Come to the marriage feast. So they go. The servants come back and they say, they're not coming. Some of them made fun of it. Some of them just kind of scoffed at it. And some act like they just didn't even care. They're not coming. Well, I mean, probably most humans in that situation, especially someone with the power of a king, would say, well, I'll teach them a lesson. But the king didn't. He says, well, let's get some other fellows, you servants over here, go invite them again. Maybe there's some kind of misunderstanding or something. So he sends them out again. God's long suffering. He wants all to come to repentance, 2 Peter 3:9. When the invitation was sent, all things were ready. We already noticed that. God had prepared from creation. God knew of his plan to send his son. Jesus came into the world when there was, what Galatians 4:4 calls the fullness of time. God supplies all man's spiritual needs through his son. And here's the deal. If I'm not satisfied with that, and if you're not satisfied with that, well, what are you going to do? There's just no hope. He's not going to negotiate with us. I mean, he's God. I'm not God. You're not God. Some people, they just, and you see it right here in Matthew 22, some people, they just don't want what God is offering. God's not going to say, well, fellas, let's sit down at the table and let's talk about this. You tell me what you feel like your needs are, your wants are, and let's see if we can't work out some kind of compromise. Folks, no. That's not happening. God is God. And the irony of all that is, he knows what's best for us anyways. And so if we would dare to, not be satisfied with that or to try to change that, well, we would end up doing so to our detriment anyways. Regarding the Lord's invitation, note here that salvation is like a feast. There are great blessings to be received if you come to the feast, but there's no food for those who reject the invitation. Can you imagine those guys say, look, I got other things to do, I'm not coming, but if you would, just pack me up a plate, send it out to my house. Can you imagine? That's how some people treat the Lord, isn't it? I don't have time to be involved in the church and to be there for Bible study, to be there for worship. But I tell you what, I'm really looking forward to heaven one day. Well, you got to come to the feast. It's a privilege. Notice also we could say about the invitation, it's a privilege to be invited by the King. It ought to cause us to be excited, to be happy. Though it is an invitation, we are obliged to accept it. God commands all men everywhere to repent, Acts 17:30. And there are serious consequences for rejection. So these invited guests, they didn't come. No citizens of the king have a right to reject his invitation. It's interesting, in the parable of the wicked husbandman, you have Jesus portrayed as the son of a landowner, householder. But in this parable, here you have Jesus as the son of a king. And to reject the invitation of a king is going to carry a lot sterner consequences than to reject a householder. Either way, it's destruction, but you kind of see it's ramping up here a little bit. Jesus is showing he's not just the son of any old person. He's the son of the King of Kings, the God of heaven. But, some are just too busy with other things to care about the king's invitation. Sadly, that's still true today. To reject the invitation of God is to say, I don't want it, I don't need it, or I've got more important things to do. Sometimes we have a gospel feast, such as a gospel meeting or times of study, times of worship, and there are folks that sometimes will just choose not to be there, just willingly choose. I'm not talking about sick or, you know, tied up with work or something like that hinders us. I'm talking just choosing, I don't think I'm going to go. That's saying I got other more important things to do. And we certainly don't want to think that way. Some of them, of course, as we mentioned, even persecuted the servants of the king. And then you have the king's reaction to this rejection, right? The king is filled with wrath. As a result, he destroys their city. God was patient with the Jews. Even many times when they didn't listen, he would send out more servants, prophets, warnings. Obviously, here you have a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Jesus later is going to speak of Jerusalem's destruction in the last couple of verses of chapter 23 and really more about half or more of chapter 24, verses 1 through 35. The king says the guests who were invited but did not come, they were unworthy. And you know, in the book of Acts, this is what we see. The gospel goes first to the Jews, and then it goes to the Gentiles because, for the most part, the Jews rejected it. But here are these people, and they were bidden. You know, the king, obviously, in that culture, in that context, he's going to invite, it would be the wealthy people, right? Kind of high-class type people. They're going to be the ones first invited. And some of these Jewish leaders, they kind of viewed themselves spiritually as spiritual high class, highfalutin. I used to hear my mom say a lot growing up. And these people, maybe they think they're somebody, and they're so important that we don't have to accept an invitation from the king. That's kind of how the Jews got. And another expression I heard a lot growing up was, don't get too big for your britches. Well, they got a little big for their britches spiritually. They got a lot big for their britches. And they just decide, you know what? And so that's when he says, you know, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out to every. Can you imagine? Here you are. You're just a beggar, a poor person. And somebody stops and says, and they would know, the servants of the king would be identifiable by clothing and things like that. And the servant of the king stops and says, sir, how would you like to come to the marriage feast for the king's son? And you're like, do what? I mean, can you imagine the last time a beggar had a good square meal, or let alone meat for a meal in that culture? Again, that's something that was very fancy. It was for occasions, and even then, only if you could afford it. And he's like, hey man, if this is a joke, it's not funny. Don't make fun of me. I can't help it that I'm sitting here and I'm poor. And the guy's like, no, the king has invited you. Come on. Man, isn't that something? And so he invites these other people. The wedding is filled with guests. And again, I think there's a lesson in that for us. That shows God's plans can't be defeated. Oh, you know, the Jews think, well, we'll just reject the invitation. God says the wedding's going to be filled with guests. The feast is going to be filled out. But God only wants those who are willing to come, right? Whosoever will, let him take of the water of life freely, Revelation 22:17. So here comes this robeless man. I just want to say this, and we'll close out with this, you know, concluding this parable. You know, sometimes we may read that and we say, man, you know, he went out and he just invited the poor people, and here's this poor guy, bless his heart, he comes in his overalls, as Jerry Clower would say, you know, and all he's got is you know, normal attire, and he gets in trouble, and they kick him out. Here's the thing, and again, in that culture, the guest, the host, provided you with garments. And so when they went and invited that beggar, they'd say, look, he's going to provide you everything you need. He's going to provide clothing. He's going to provide food. All you got to do is just come. There's a verse in Revelation 19, verse 8 that says, the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. And so what that is, that's talking about people who come to the feast, those who obey the gospel. You can't just come in any old garment. You can't come into the church a demon and live like a demon. You got to live like the Christ. You got to live lives that are holy, or the Father will say, you cannot stay here at the feast. Good stuff here from Matthew 22. Tim, you're going to say something real quick?
I think there's something to be said about 2 John 6 through 10, where a man comes in God's speed, and it sounds like that's what happened here. Here's a person that it is not what they appear to be, and you're out of
Right, yeah. He's purporting to be something, and he didn't take advantage of what the host had provided for him, and that's something the host would have provided. And in fact, the fact that he was speechless tells you something. He doesn't say, well, you didn't give me a garment. He just says, uh-oh. And so, yeah, so we got to maintain that purity and that holiness of life. All right, thank y'all very much. I'm over time, and the kids are anxiously waiting. They're chomping at the bit, as we say. Yes, sir.